Welcome everyone. This is Matthew Chase. I am the San Marcos librarian. I think I've met some of you. I don't know if I've met most of you in person, probably either because you're on another campus or because of the closures, you know. But in any case, this is a faculty development workshop that I want to present to you all, and this is on the topic of digital exhibits for teaching, learning, and engagement. Essentially, what I'm hoping to do is cover essentially what the digital exhibit series at the USA Library is, kind of cover, you know, what its intended purpose is, what we have so far there, and hopefully some future directions where we can go with it. But I think in terms of yourself as faculty and your roles in that, I wanted to present this also as an opportunity for an alternative teaching method for learning experiences, like kind of enhancing them and making them more participatory as well as more immersive. And in that way, you know, hopefully facilitating engagement in the classroom and even as we'll talk about with the greater community of the university as well as communities in the public. So yeah, so hopefully this will be just that. But yeah, we'll go forward. And again, feel free to drop any questions, comments, or anything like that as we go along. So with that, let me proceed. So probably the main question though first is what exactly is an exhibit? And particularly why is it at the library? Because I'm sure you know, your general conception of what an exhibit is usually situated in a museum setting, and I'll kind of go into about how libraries are getting more and more involved in terms of exhibits and particularly putting them in the context of scholarly conversations. So yeah, so for an exhibit, basically the basic definition of it is that it's a collection or a selection of items that are centered on a specific focus. In this case, it could be a particular theme, a particular question that it's hoping to explore, not necessarily the answer, but just more the exploration of it, the interpretations and the critical thinking regarding that particular question or theme. And then with the relevant context informed by the scholarly literature. So in a lot of circumstances with exhibits, they can be scholarly or they cannot be. And for our particular purposes though, I feel like, especially within our standing as a health sciences university, particularly a graduate university, you know, that these exhibits should be driven at least primarily through the scholarly literature, or at least what is the evidence telling us. And I feel like this will actually have a lot greater consequences, especially in terms of using these as platforms for student engagement and learning and pedagogy in general. So yeah, the second point I make here about exhibits as scholarship and research. So like I said, not conventionally, exhibits don't necessarily need to be scholarly or research driven. However, with the emergence of the role of libraries in particular taking on exhibits outside of like museum contexts, they've really librarians have been really exploring how exhibits can operate within the scholarly conversation and actually become works of in-depth research and scholarship. And this is reflected also in the practice of creating an exhibit that demonstrates in-depth research in the text, in the references, and in the interpretations that are applied to the selection or collection of items around a particular theme or, again, a question. So again, this is really a move forward with how exhibits are kind of operating. And in particular for me, I also not only feel that they can operate as works of scholarship, but also exactly for the point of this workshop, as works of open education, or actually become educational resources that can be readily applied within higher education. So my third point about enduring value, this is really addressing the fact of how conventional exhibits have often operated as being physical installations, as I'll talk about with the on-campus exhibits that we've had, especially with those, because it's a physical installation requiring time, resources, and in particular, and more importantly, space, they're often very temporary in nature. So the preservation of it usually only lasts a certain point until the exhibit has to be basically uninstalled and basically broken down, either for the shift into a new exhibit, because again, there's just a limitation in terms of space. And so it really raises the question, how can we really preserve these exhibits and the works involved as a long-standing value, especially in terms of scholarship, because that's really one of the things is like, how are future researchers and future scholars and even clinicians or any other practitioners that are involved in evidence and finding it really going to be able to seek these types of works out afterwards, after they've been uninstalled. So the response has largely been the digitization of these works in terms of putting them into institutional repositories. For example, these exhibits could have been placed in the institutional repository at our university, although they are not at this time, but for various reasons. But mainly that would be one example. A lot of libraries are actually putting their exhibits and preserving them within institutional repositories as open access research and education. And then, or they also preserve them through their websites as well. And that's actually going to be our example here in our case with our series. And then the fourth point about exhibits is that they're often and ideally should be community driven. As we'll kind of talk about in terms of the library exhibit series here, they've been primarily initiated through library staff in terms of the launch, the design, and the installation of them. But the hope is that this series will eventually transform into a very community driven process through our university. Again, allowing for students, for faculty, or any other members of our university community to actually contribute and create and curate these works of scholarship and research. So I'll just stop here just for a moment. Is there any particular questions that you might have or any comments in terms of this, like definition of like what an exhibit is? Or maybe you had a different viewpoint in terms of before I kind of presented this. Just kind of curious.
Well, I like the ones that you did last fall because they were very, very interesting and a nice respite. And I hope that a lot of people got to take advantage.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you for that. And actually, that's going to be something I'll be commenting about, actually, especially with the on-campus exhibits and how we've worked into preserving them as well. So no, thank you. And actually, some of the comments that you made about how it's a site of respite, I'll actually kind of talk about it in a bit, especially in terms of what I've received in terms of student feedback. So yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. So, but yeah, again, feel free to drop any questions, any comments as we go along. I'll be happy to, take a moment and respond as needed. But yeah, so with that, we'll move on to the USAHS Library Digital Exhibit Series in particular. So yeah, this basically launched back in June 2020 as an extension of campus library exhibits. So as Marilyn alluding to that, we've already been creating exhibits before we even did digital exhibits, particularly at the San Marcos campus library. I had initiated two particular exhibits, one in fall of 2019 and then another in spring of 2020. And particularly, I've always wanted to look into the idea of digitize these works long before, the campus closures with the pandemic and stuff like that. But that really kind of inspired, a drive to really explore what can we do to really transform these works into a digital context so they can still last, especially within the context of that we were no longer able to go on campus and students weren't able to actually see the various works that we had. And again, it was also in response to not just that, but also just the fact that because of our library, the space is understandably very limited, like because we're also having to carry the collections of bone models, books, and all that, as well as study spaces and such. So really, we were really limited to one exhibit per term or per year, depending on what we were doing. So really, once one exhibit was created and ready to be installed, we had to bring down or deinstall it or uninstall it in that sense. Yeah, sorry, I just gave a moment. My internet connection's a little unstable at times, so if I pause, that's usually why, because my voice will, go very, very slow. So if you happen to notice that and you want me to repeat something, that's totally fine. But yeah, so if you see me pausing, that's usually why. But yeah, so essentially with the digital exhibit series, what we wanted to do was adapt the two existing on-campus exhibits, which I'll kind of go into and actually show like how they actually look in just a moment. But basically, we hosted it through the library website. We kind of explored a bunch of different platforms that we could have hosted them through, particularly like the SOAR USA or institutional repository, as I kind of mentioned before. There's also another open access platform known as Omeka, which is specifically a software that's specifically designed for digital exhibits. But after a lot of consultation and looking at our various options, it was chosen that the library website itself would be the most ideal way of displaying these exhibits. Mainly because it's one of the main traffic areas for students, for faculty, and just the university community in general. So it proved to be the most ideal spot. In particular, SOAR USA was probably the second most, but mainly it was because the display of these exhibits would be a little bit different, and the library website offered a little bit more flexibility in terms of being a little bit more flexible with multimedia in particular, and particularly the display of it. So yeah, we'll easily go into how they actually look on the library website, so I hope you'll enjoy that little process there. But yeah, so basically the whole goal behind these exhibits, even before they transition into being a digital exhibit, was to engage the university community in advancing the discussion about the sociocultural impact of medicine. So particularly these exhibits are centered around themes of social, cultural, ethical, and historical dimensions regarding the development of medicine across, various, disciplines. It could be of physical therapy, of occupational therapy, speech language pathology, all of our, associated disciplines, but even outside of those as well, and in terms of how they intersect with medicine's development. But yeah, and the other point here is that these exhibits are actually, we've wanted to open them up as being open scholarly works as well as open educational works, as I'm sure if you've attended some of the webinars and workshops of my colleague Eric Robinson, the scholarly communications librarian, he talks a lot about open access and copyright and, sharing our scholarly works, especially within the context of our institutional repository, SOAR at USA. But we wanted to do the same with these exhibits. So basically, these exhibits are licensed under a Creative Commons license, which essentially just requires that people can adapt them and share them, but as long as it's within the purpose of non-commercial in particular. And then if they do adapt them, they do have to use the same or a similar type of license in those derivative works. Yeah, and over there I just showed the like symbol that they currently have, like with the current exhibits that we have. So that's another point we wanted to also make, is to make these as openly accessible as possible, while still, taking ownership of, where these works really came from. But yeah, and so with that, I'll move on. But if you have any questions, oh, actually, I do see a question. The link posted isn't working for me. Let's see. Well, there's two links on there. Yeah, if you go into the meeting invitation, there's also the SurveyMonkey link there as well. It's probably because I posted two links, so I don't know if you're copy and pasting both of them at the same time. But yeah, that might be an issue. I'm not too sure. But I can easily repost the link just to make sure. There it goes. Yeah, so that is the survey link for this. Yeah, of course. But yeah, so with that, we'll move on with this and actually be able to hopefully get some more information. In particular, actually seeing the exhibits that we have on display right now. So as I said, we have two exhibits currently, mainly because, like I said, this exhibit initiative started back in June. So really, it's only been like maybe yeah, I'm going to get the ball rolling, especially now that they're fully installed and ready to go, and we can create new ones. Sorry, I saw it was unstable again. So, but yeah, so basically where to find the actual exhibits in particular is on the library website, like I've mentioned. In particular, there is a tab under resources here that has digital exhibits. I'll post the link as well to the chat as well, just to make it a little bit more convenient. And that way you can kind of view it for yourself as well. So let me post here. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, this basically links to this particular page. And in particular, this is kind of like the home site for digital exhibits in general. So yeah, as you can see, I have a lot of the same information about how the university curates and builds unique digital exhibits of scholarship and education, specifically regarding dimensions of medicine. And as you can also see, there is information about creating or maybe hosting physical installations at one or more of the university campus libraries. That kind of depends on specifically consulting with your local librarian. If you're like, you want to like see about creating a physical installation at your campus, you'll just want to consult with with your campus librarian. So if it's like San Marcos, consult with me. Because oftentimes, like I said, it often deals with issues of space and everything like that. Currently maybe it's not the most relevant or more effective time to do it, since there's limited traffic at the campus at this time. But in the future, that could definitely be a possibility. Also, as I kind of mentioned here, I do host virtual tours of the exhibits pretty regularly. And they're just like, yeah, we go through the exhibits. I'm also like wanting to create more like dialogues instead, like more events that are associated with creating a dialogue regarding these exhibits. So not necessarily just a tour, but also creating a conversation regarding these. So yeah, that's one of my plans actually for this year as well. But yeah, if you have any questions regarding any of the exhibits, or you want to look into exploring on creating one yourself, and we'll easily go into that shortly, is contacting us directly. Probably it would be best to contact us through the email here, library@usa.edu. Reaches all, so one of us will be able to reach out to you and follow up. But yeah, you see like there's been a slider kind of going through that's kind of like showing some of the exhibits that we have. In particular, at the bottom, we have the browse the digital exhibits. Currently, like I said, there's 2 of them at this time, and I'll kind of briefly talk about each of them. But yeah, essentially, one that we had created at the San Marcos campus library was the Theater of the Body, a Renaissance of Human Anatomy, which was installed on campus in fall of 2019. Was the first one, actually. So it's kind of our first venture into exhibits. Particularly the curator and creator was actually me, mainly, and then also supported with Sophia as well, our circulation manager. So some of you may recognize her as well. But yeah, essentially this exhibit in particular was the exploration regarding the history of modern human anatomy and how it kind of developed across the centuries and the decades. We gave particular focus on the medical renaissance that happened during the European Renaissance of the 14th and, through the 17th century. So mainly it does focus on like Western development of anatomy, but we do give some discussion regarding the untold or like more hidden figures of anatomy globally as well, outside of Western medicine. So yeah, basically you can kind of see there's a display of a gallery here, which has all of the different items that we've curated. These were particularly collected through the works of the National Library of Medicine in particular, who made them public domain. And just because of by virtue of the fact that they were already made in the 14th and 17th centuries, or between those centuries, copyright had already expired, so they were easily able to be curated and shown. So yeah, you can actually like filter through each of these in particular. Each of them you can readily click on and actually explore different, more specific information regarding each of these. These were all, like most of the information had to be collected through scholarly literature or other types of sources to identify like the title, the original creator, and a little bit more information regarding the actual work itself. And when possible, we would try to give some context around the creation of this particular work or works associated with the author. And yeah, we also identify the rights of it as well. So which is an important point that I'll actually kind of go into probably later on in this about copyright considerations when actually curating an exhibit. But yeah, so each of these has like their own distinct display of information, but you can also see, and this is where literature comes in, a real in-depth exploration about related contexts and subtopics regarding the theme of modern anatomy and its history. Particularly, we talk a bit about the ancient anatomists, so in particular about ancient Greece and the Greek science that developed for Western anatomy in particular, and how actually a lot of it came about from like Greek science, and in particular because of that, ending at like it says here, like 210 AD, essentially anatomy stops for the most part in terms of developing after Galen's work, because for the most part during the Middle Ages and such, anatomists would just rely on the texts and the drawings of this one person who had curated a bunch of information of anatomy, but really hadn't done dissections themselves. Of human dissections. They would actually really just depend on animal dissections. It was mainly due to cultural beliefs and religious beliefs that human dissection was largely prohibited. And that really continued on until like the 14th century AD, for at least in terms of European development. But as we kind of talk about too, we talk about the gaps in the anatomical record. So we do discuss the fact that history doesn't really pay much attention to the works of anatomists in like Persia and India and China and other parts of the world, and largely only really focus on Western science and its own development. But as shown here is that even though Western science was very stagnant between, the very early like AD to like the 14th century, the rest of the world was actually rapidly developing and constantly improving upon the theories of Galen and others. And we're constantly collaborating with each other. So it's a really interesting development in terms of that, because a lot of times we see there's seems to be a real over focus on Western contributions. But yeah, and then we also talk about the medical renaissance in particular, and we do talk about certain figures, particularly Andreas Vesalius, who was particularly prominent because he um, was very notorious for challenging the theories of traditional context of like Galen theory and all that kind of stuff about anatomy, and particularly came up with a lot of the illustrations and particularly through his work, The Fabrica, which, as it kind of shows here, really revolutionized because it was really one of the first times that anatomists were working with artists, they were working with printmakers, and to create these like collective works of anatomy. But yeah, and then we also talk about the illustrated human, which really into the technologies back then as well as now in terms of how that developed across from, you know, sketches, because really anatomy didn't, or at least anatomical illustration really didn't begin until about the late Middle Ages. With handmade drawings, but usually those handmade drawings were just based on the works again of like ancient Greek scientists, and it wasn't until about the Renaissance that more revolutionary type of anatomical illustrations were happening, particularly with the introduction of printmaking technologies that really helped out, especially with engravings and other types of works. Yeah, so like, you know, connecting the dots to like, you know, more modern types of technologies with photography, X-ray imaging, digital imaging that we're seeing now. So yeah. And then probably more controversially, we do mention how dissection in particular, human dissection, you know, as I kind of alluded to, it had a very controversial history and often was prohibited, mainly because it was deemed as violating the human body. But because of that, especially during the Renaissance when it started becoming more in demand to have human dissection and have cadavers, governments would actually associate or would actually legislate human dissection as part of capital punishment. So there was a real blur between dissection being a medical practice versus a retributive practice. Or criminal justice type of approach. But yeah, so there's that. And, you know, we have like a survey, of course, and this is kind of how we kind of assess a lot of our services. And also, I also wanted to make a point of having actual recommended readings, which were really a lot of the scholarly literature that was drawn to inform this particular exhibit. And all of them are either accessible through our databases as linked here, or you can request them through Interlibrarian. Another couple point or one additional to make is, you know, actually having a conversation about this. So I did develop a discussion forum so people can actually, so yeah, I created a discussion forum where people could actually, you know, join in the conversation and share their thoughts. And I've already had like over the last like 6 months had some students happen to find this digital exhibit and be able to, you know, have some discussions about it. Like even one had like my classmates and I discussed a lot about the topic and found it interesting. Others said that the images were pretty cool, which is great. And others were, you know, it's crazy to think where we came from and where we are now. Others found it thought-provoking and such. So you get to have a real conversation with the whole community in particular. And we definitely encourage not only just sharing your thoughts about it, but also any resources that might be relevant or art and conversations. In particular, I do have this one idea, and I'll probably discuss it probably more in terms of you know, how we can engage students is actually having students either creating their own types of illustrations of anatomy. That'd be I thought that would be a pretty neat project in terms of having students do, in terms of actually understanding the work that is involved in terms of illustration. But yeah, and with that, unless there's any questions, let's see, I don't see any questions at the moment. That's totally fine. But and feel free to unmute yourself as well, and feel free to stop me at any point. But essentially, I was going to show about the cures and curses. I won't go as in depth because it's a lot of the same display as well. But essentially, this one is talking about the modern history of pharmaceutical advertising. In particular, we wanted to focus on how advertising had basically impacted health literacy and the even the role of the physician or just the health practitioner in terms of protecting patients' rights and you know, the ethics of what pharmaceutical information is being delivered or being openly accessible to the public and consumed. And those kind of responsibilities and ethics and other types of issues and controversies that are involved. And particularly this one is a collection of, again, public domain, because these were made during the well past copyright expiration. But these were made during the late 19th and early 20th century. And these are basically advertisements that were made in the US to promote what were known as patent medicines, which were essentially these like non-prescription pharmaceutical products, over the counter, essentially. And a lot of them did not have a lot of, even though they were promoted to help you with your, the purity of your blood, to your aches and pains, to mental health even, most of them were not very effective at all. And in fact, a lot of them actually contain very copious amounts of potentially dangerous products. And we kind of talk about that more in terms of like alcohol. There's actually one example we have here is the low soothing syrup basically had copious amounts of alcohol and morphine in particular, and it was meant to soothe the teething for children. So, and it led to, you know, the deaths of infants and young children as a result, and was banned, but it wasn't even until the 1930s when it was eventually removed because of that. And even the American Medical Association labeled the product as a baby killer, essentially. So that's one of the more extreme examples. Others were just you know, filled with alcohol or other types of drugs in order to basically provide relief, but really not like long-standing cure-alls like it was promised, essentially. So yeah, essentially you can read more about the history here, about the power of pharmaceutical advertising. I also wanted to make it a point of talking about, you know, racial imagery in advertising, and even the position of women in advertising, and talking about that to an extent. And then later on, it talks about specific drugs that were particularly added into these cure-alls, essentially. Cocaine being one, marijuana, alcohol here. And then eventually the patent medicine crisis, which actually was the thing that actually the patent medicine crisis actually particularly was the one that led to the development of the Food and Drug Administration in particular, as well as several acts of legislation that would provide more tighter controls over the drugs that we've kind of listed here. And in particular, how that's affected us contemporarily in terms of how those drugs are now used or being so yeah, and then again, survey here, but I also like to make a point of including the readings as well. And then even again, a discussion about that and how other students are, like, I'm presuming a lot of these are students, this is largely anonymous, but how people thought they learned new info about how pharmaceuticals, you know, really developed. You know, even one was applying how learning how being a woman needed to be cured and how many people believe their product are cure-alls when they really are just hard drugs. Learning them to believe they were cured, but reality just being drugged to not feel anything. And others, like I really love this comment where it was like, I like that I get informed about new information that I would not have been provided otherwise unless I asked. So yeah, I really like that comment a lot. And that's kind of really the point too, is like just it's supposed to be acting as a self-directed learning experience in particular, at least in terms of how these, stood not only as on campus, but also digitally as well. But yeah, is there any particular questions about these two exhibits before I move on into the actual, like what you can do with them as well? Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you're enjoying it. Yeah, I really think all these have really interesting and very controversial histories that even I would not have been aware of if I had not done the research and looked into them. So yeah, again, it's all about that research process and exploring the literature and exploring new knowledge and being able to share that conversation with others. But yeah, so with that, I'll move back into my presentation for just a bit. Let me bring it back. Oh, let's see. Yeah, there we go. How do we contribute to exhibits? Yes, so I'll talk about that actually. Yeah, okay, so how do we contribute to exhibits? Yeah, I'll probably get into that in just a few minutes actually now that I think about it. In terms of how you can actually have students have a project where they can create their own exhibits, or where you can even lead a creation or curation of an exhibit. And I'll talk about the process. Actually, I think it's like the next slide from here. But I figured, since I've been talking a lot about digital exhibits, I figured it's time that we talk about how we can actually apply them. So yeah, I had a few ideas about engaging students here, and feel free to put in the comments about, ideas that you are currently thinking about, because maybe there's something I didn't even think about or, process. So, and this is where the conversation bit I like to have comes in. So yeah, one of the things I definitely thought would be great is using an exhibit for class discussion prompts, especially because a lot of the current exhibits in particular talk about talking about ethics and health literacy and technology and the advancements made in that context. And so I think it'd be really interesting to where just even on a discussion board or even in a classroom, context, like a live, meeting of the students, where you can actually have these type of conversations. And being able to reflect on what happened in the past and how that's informed where we're at now currently, as well as what may be in the future, what may be in store. I also thought they would be really great as prompts for reflective writing. Again, talking about those discussions about ethics and technology, maybe our relationships, in particular when we're talking about like the theory of the body and human anatomy, our relationship to the cadaver. Because I know there have been, I think there have been student projects where I've seen that, where students get to reflect about about the care and the responsibility to cadavers and their use in science. Also artistic projects. I mentioned about like a really neat thing I think would be, either replicating these type of anatomical drawings or having students create their own, and actually discovering the amount of work that it takes to actually do them. And in particular, there's a discussion regarding the human anatomy exhibit, where I talk about, or at least the literature kind of informed me to talk about, was how the illustration of the human body has changed, not only in terms of the technology and the accuracy that we're now being able to achieve, but in some ways it also talks about how the human body has become almost dehumanized, like in the sense like just become an abstract object to observe nowadays with modern technologies. When in the illustrations that I was showing, you kind of see where a lot of them have like these very dramatized and human-like postures, or they're doing some type of everyday task, or otherwise illustrating about the human condition, not just about the actual human body itself in terms of its functions, but also just the meanings behind it in terms of, again, the human condition and human nature. So I thought that would be really neat. Presentations would definitely be a welcome thing about, like, maybe they discover more about the punishment side of things, where I was talking about capital punishment. Maybe they can do further exploration about that and see what else they can present. Students, yeah, my third point here, I said, like, students can create mini exhibits or digital artifacts. What I was really kind of thinking about too is that maybe if you didn't have necessarily the time or resources to really commit students to creating a full-fledged exhibit, maybe you could create a more miniaturized version of an exhibit where a student finds a historical object or any type of object. It might be even like about a prosthetic device or some other type of technology, or have deep dive into the literature about it in terms of its development, its effectiveness. In terms of like its effectiveness and like just the future of it as well as the past. So yeah, almost having like a digital artifact to really just address as rather than having, like, again, this like full-fledged exhibit, which we'll also get into. I know there was a question about that. Fourth point, I know there was even though I've recently held a webinar about, or a workshop regarding mindfulness practices and having more contemplative pedagogy with students, what I hadn't realized until I was in the process of doing that workshop was how the digital exhibits, and I know one of you had already alluded to how these digital exhibits or exhibits in general can be a respite or a site of respite. In particular, I did get a lot of feedback from students who would often use the images as a point of rest. They would actually use that as a point to take a break from their studies or their assignments, and just be able to and just observe and take notice of the different details within the art pieces, and then come back, and kind of feel a little bit more refreshed, a little bit more just taking their eyes away from the screen and such. And even though with digital exhibits you can't necessarily take your eyes off the screen, but it is a different way of looking at things in terms of looking at art, in particular with these two exhibits that I had. And there is an actual mindfulness practice known as beholding, which is kind of that same point. It's just taking a moment of like quiet contemplation as you observe a singular object. In this case, it could be one of the images in the exhibit, and just really study its different details, and really just kind of letting your mind, observe it, take notice of certain details, and then, coming back a little bit more clear, having a little bit more clarity in terms of the work ahead. So I thought that would be a really nice thing. So it's more not necessarily a project oriented, but it's just more of a passive almost teaching method, but still I think could be really effective in that sense. And then, yeah, my fifth point, which actually was going into how can individual students or student groups create their own full-fledged digital exhibits as a scholarly project. I think this was kind of like my main inspiration idea kind of thing in terms of how students can actually lead their own exhibit project. And I think for me, if you look at the exhibits and kind of compare them to the research process, I think they're very ssimilar in the sense of like not only having to identify your theme, which could be in a way your research question or your question in general, and then having to come up with methodology in this term, it could be more in terms of the curation of the actual items themselves, and how did you, what kind of criteria did you set in terms of choosing which ones to keep and which ones to use and display. And then even the literature review, which I think is probably a really important thing that students are still trying to, that our students are still trying to learn and get really a grasp of, is just the overall exploration of the literature and being able to write a synthesized product. So yeah, I think that's where they can really come into play here. So with that, because I see the question already, but if you have any other questions, feel free again to drop them in the chat. Or even unmute yourself. I'll go into that actually about the steps to take. So I typically create, or I typically take in creating a digital exhibit. So kind of like we just talked about here, the main thing is to develop the theme of the exhibit. Identifying subtopics like you saw with like how maybe racism in advertising, or gender in advertising, stuff like that. Relevant concepts and maybe relevant figures, in terms of who might be in the theme. Like for example, I was talking about like Andreas Vesalius and Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, stuff like that. Or just general concepts that are being treated, such as like capital punishment and such. Questions, etc. And basically, the second point is probably the most particularly unique about the exhibit versus a regular research project, is creating or curating relevant items to be included in the exhibit. Knowing which types of materials might be most appropriate for your particular theme. It could be video, text-based, images, audio, etc. Like for example, most of mine were mainly based in imagery, but could easily be more text-based. It could be writings. It could be video as well, audio, anything like that. But the important thing too, and I'll talk about this too, is copyright considerations. So in particular, like if the items that you are displaying, you've created or at least own in some way in terms of the copyright, you really have no issues about sharing them. But if you are trying to share imagery, videos, or other types of materials that you do not have the copyright holdings of personally, then it becomes a little trickier. And there are ways to go around it. And luckily for librarians, we do have a little bit of knowledge in that way. And that's where we can largely come in as well in terms of determining that. And I'll actually have another slide about that in case you have more questions about it. But and then the third point, the third point within creating or curating relevant items is collecting items information, like I showed about the name, the title, the author, publication info, in particular also the copyright holdings. Like we do need to identify that as well. So the third point, or the third major point, is exploring the scholarly literature to inform the theme. So again, that's going to really drive the story or the narrative that you're really kind of going with the exhibit in terms of the interpretations, the facts, the other facets regarding the exhibit and its theme. And then, yeah, so where does the library come into this? We come into several different points in this process. Particularly if you do want to create a full-fledged exhibit and have it hosted through the library website, you do have to consult with us in terms of getting that approved. We're pretty flexible with that. But yeah, we'll just talk with you in terms of different, details about it in terms of like, does the exhibit kind of fit with the overall mission and curriculum of the university, stuff like that. But I'm sure if it's going to be more driven around the student projects and such, it probably would. Yeah, and just like for the library website itself, it's managed by the library staff, so you'll need us to actually be able to install the exhibits digitally, so we can frame it in however way is best for you in terms of like a gallery or videos and such like that. But we'll be having the ones to do that. You can just tell us and kind of outline how you kind of want it, and we can work with you in terms of what our library website is capable of to meet those needs. And then research assistance, yeah, if it's about searching the scholarly literature and you're having a hard time identifying keywords or other types of databases and other types of information sources, we definitely can come into that for sure. So yeah, feel free to seek our assistance with that. Copyright guidance, yeah, like I said, that's one of our main fortes as well as librarians, is that we can definitely help in that regard, identify sources of open access or public domain materials and such. So that might be a really good a way that we can assist you. But yeah, so the other thing about the exhibits as well, I don't want to necessarily want to say that you have to use our library website for exhibits. Like if you don't really want to create an exhibit under our series, that's totally fine. You could definitely create one through like WordPress if you want to just create a free website that way and such, and just make it more centered around your class and not necessarily as accessible to the open public or anything like that. That's totally fine. But I definitely recommend through us, because we'll definitely be promoting it. Like I said, we'll do like virtual tours. We can do some different types of events and definitely help get it promoted and really enhance the scholarly profile of those who are creating the actual work. So, and you know, we're really, I like to think of us as really collaborative partners in this process. So yeah, so I definitely recommend it, and seeing what kind of options we can do. Any particular questions regarding this in particular before I go into copyright considerations? It was kind of like a final point I have, but if anyone has any comments or ideas about what we can do, feel free. And just because we're getting towards the end, I'm also going to repost the survey link as well. Just take the moment to do that, in case anyone didn't have an opportunity to do so. But yeah, so that's one way. So copyright considerations, and I'll kind of briefly go over this because I feel like there are certain webinars, particularly through my colleague Eric Robinson, who really gets more in depth about copyright considerations and Creative Commons. This is just more specific to exhibits in particular. But yeah, so really the main question you really have to consider is, you know, who owns the rights to the exhibit's items that you're curating. If you did not create the items, there might be an issue with copyright. So really my solution to really mitigate issues with copyright is to curate items from the public domain or under Creative Commons licenses. And not necessarily all Creative Commons licenses will allow for this, because we also have to consider the fact that our university is a for-profit university. So even fair use guidelines can have limitations for us, and it's a little bit more tricky for that in terms of what is available for commercial use in particular, or for-profit use. Even despite us being a higher education institution, there are limitations for that. But I did want to identify there are really great resources for public domain and open access materials. I named 3 of them here in particular. Wikimedia has really great media, as well as different licenses that are offered, and they'll actually show what kind of licenses they are. So it's a little bit more clear, because I know there are times when you look at an image and you're trying to decipher whether or not it's open access or some type of public domain, and it's hard to tell. Wikimedia is pretty clear about what is under a certain license or domain. Flickr Commons is really great too. This one's specifically more geared towards images though, but you can find like public domain, various Creative Commons licenses as well. Actually, funny enough, the exhibits that I curated were from the Flickr channel of the National Library of Medicine. They provided like downloadable high-resolution images for those, and which really helped a lot in terms of creating the first 2 exhibits. And then actually Creative Commons, the website actually has a really nifty search engine that allows you to search various Creative Commons media across multiple websites. And I know they just kind of started creating that and making it more usable. Right now, they do offer like a tab for like audio and video, but at this time, it doesn't, they're still in the works in processing that. So right now, it seems to be more focused on imagery or just photographs or any image-based materials. But yeah, I think with that pretty much sums up what I wanted to present here. But yeah, I'm always happy to have a conversation about this, even afterwards. Like if you have any questions, in particular, this exhibit series has been kind of a passion project of mine that finally came to realization last year. So I'm really happy to see that. But it is a library-wide type of service, so any of our librarians can definitely assist. But in terms of probably the one with the most history with it, in terms of most familiarity, would probably be me, just because it was the one I was initiating. But yeah, feel free to always contact me. Yeah, you're very welcome. And I'll even provide my email at the bottom in the chat as well, in case you ever did want to follow up with me by email. I'm always happy to consult with this. But yeah, and then these are some of the references I had regarding the the impact that exhibits are now making. But I want to thank you all for joining me on this. And yeah, I hope this was, exactly. I was hoping it was going to be a great faculty scholarship opportunity. So awesome. I'm glad to hear that.